My name is Caroline Hayes, but everyone who knows me calls me Cara. I'm 32 years old now, and for the better part of a decade, I've been at the helm of my late father's investment firm. A world of sharp angles, clear data, and decisive action. It's a world I understand. It's a world I command, but I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that the very qualities that made me successful there, my directness, my unwavering focus on the bottom line, what my English family lovingly called my crass American approach, would one day become the only thing standing between their centuries-old legacy and the auction block. They say the sweetest revenge isn't planned, that it's a dish best served cold. My story isn't about revenge, not really. It's about the moment when the people who have spent your entire life looking down on you are suddenly forced to look up. Before I dive into the story of how I ended up in a crumbling English manor, holding the fate of my mother's family in my hands, I'd love it if you'd let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel, and if you've ever felt underestimated or judged by the very people who should have supported you the most, do me a favor and hit that like button. For all the new faces here, make sure you subscribe to join a community of people who truly understand that sometimes your greatest strength is the very thing others perceive as a flaw. My first memory of Blackwood Manor was the smell. It wasn't a bad smell, not exactly. It was a complicated, layered scent of ancient stone, beeswax, damp wool, and something else, something like pressed flowers that had been left in a book for a century too long. It was the smell of time itself, standing still. I was 10 years old, on my first trip to England after my mother Amelia had passed away. My father thought it was important for me to know her roots, to connect with the family she'd left behind when she fell in love with a loud, ambitious American software engineer. He'd hoped for a bridge to be built. Instead, I found a moat. I arrived at Heathrow feeling like a diplomat from another planet, my crisp new dress feeling uncomfortably bright under the perpetually gray English sky. My cousins, Gideon and Beatrice, were there to meet me, along with their father, my Uncle Alistair. Gideon, already a teenager, gave my hand a limp shake, his eyes scanning my outfit with a flicker of amusement. Beatrice, a year or two younger than him, was more direct. "What a terribly loud color, Caroline," she'd said, her voice carrying the clear, bell-like tones of a private education. "We don't really do sunshine yellow here." That first comment set the tone for every visit that followed. My life in California was a world of sunshine, of bold ideas and bolder execution. My father's world was about building the future, about disruption and innovation. The Blackwood world was about curation of the past. They didn't build, they maintained. They didn't innovate, they preserved. And I, with my straightforward questions, my talk of school projects that involved building business plans, and my complete inability to grasp the unspoken labyrinthine rules of their social conduct, was a constant source of gentle, condescending mockery. During a visit when I was 16, I tried to talk to Gideon about my excitement for a programming course I was taking. He'd smiled a patient, patronizing smile. "How fascinating, little cousin," he'd said, swirling a glass of sherry that he was far too young to be drinking. "All those ones and zeros. It sounds dreadfully methodical. Here, let me explain the subtleties of a googly in cricket. It's about deception, you see. Artistry." He spent the next 20 minutes explaining a sport I had no interest in, not to share something he loved, but to establish his own cultural superiority. To him, my practical, tangible skill was just noise. His inherited, esoteric knowledge was true culture. Beatrice was worse. She treated my American accent like a charming speech impediment. She would correct my phrasing, not out of helpfulness, but as a public performance. "We say tomato, darling, not tomato." She'd chime in at the dinner table, making everyone pause. "And it's a jumper, not a sweater. You'll get the hang of it eventually." Every correction was a small cut, a reminder that I was an outsider, a colonial curiosity they had to endure for a few weeks every couple of years. My father's success, the source of the very funds that paid for my plane tickets, was a topic to be avoided, or worse, alluded to with polite disdain. It was new money, a phrase always delivered with a slight, apologetic wince, as if discussing a rather embarrassing ailment. Their own money, dwindling as it was old. It had pedigree. It had sat in the same accounts for generations, acquiring a patina of respectability that my father's hard-earned fortune could never hope to match. My mother, Amelia Blackwood, had been the family rebel, the younger daughter who chose love over legacy, running off to America with a man who spoke of algorithms instead of ancestry. They had never forgiven her for it. Not really. My visits were a duty, an obligation to their deceased sister's only child, but never a pleasure. I kept going, year after year, first with my father and then alone after he passed, because I felt I owed it to my mother's memory. I was chasing the ghost of a connection she had always yearned for, trying to piece together her past from the cold fragments her family offered me. But with every visit, the chasm grew wider. My world was accelerating, and theirs was slowly, gracefully grinding to a halt. So when the summons came, it was a surprise. It wasn't a friendly invitation for a summer visit. It was a terse email from Gideon himself, its formal language barely concealing a tremor of panic. It spoke of a matter of some urgency regarding the family estate, and requested my presence at my earliest convenience. There was no mockery in it, no condescension. For the first time in my life, a communication from my English cousins was devoid of irony. That, more than anything, told me something was deeply wrong. I landed in the familiar gray drizzle of Manchester and hired a car for the drive out to the countryside. As I turned onto the long, winding lane that led to the manor, flanked by ancient, moss-covered stone walls, I felt the usual knot tighten in my stomach. The house appeared through the mist, just as I remembered it, grand, imposing, and melancholic. The stone was darker, streaked with years of rain. A few slates were missing from the roof. The gardens, once impeccably manicured, were beginning to show signs of a beautiful, managed decay, giving way to simple neglect. The roses were overgrown and weeds pushed up through the gravel of the driveway. Gideon opened the massive oak door before I could even knock. He was thinner than I remembered, the easy, aristocratic confidence in his eyes replaced by a sort of haunted exhaustion. His smile didn't reach them. "Caroline, thank you for coming so quickly." "Gideon," I replied, my voice flat. "Your email sounded serious." Beatrice appeared behind him in the cavernous, cold hall. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a cashmere twin set and pearls. But like Gideon, the strain showed around her eyes. "Caroline, how good of you to tear yourself away from your spreadsheets." The old reflex was there, the need to deliver a subtle jab, but it lacked its usual conviction. It sounded tired. "It wasn't easy," I said, letting the double meaning hang in the air. "But you said it was urgent." That night, dinner was a torturous affair. Lord Alistair, my uncle, presided over the head of the long, polished table, looking impossibly frail. He seemed to have shrunk since my last visit, his tweed jacket hanging loosely on his stooped shoulders. He spoke in vague platitudes about the weather and the state of the nation, his gaze drifting towards the dark, ancestral portraits that lined the dining room walls, as if seeking their counsel. Gideon and Beatrice picked at their food, the silence between them thick with unspoken anxiety. They attempted small talk, asking about my flight, the weather in San Francisco, but their hearts weren't in it. They were actors in a play, going through the motions of a normal family dinner while the set crumbled around them. I waited, refusing to be the one to break the tension. I ate my overcooked lamb and watery potatoes, watching them. I saw the way Gideon's jaw clenched when his father sighed, the way Beatrice's fingers worried the stem of her wine glass. They were drowning, and they were trying to pretend they were merely enjoying a leisurely swim. Finally, after the plates were cleared and a subpar port was poured, Gideon cleared his throat. "Caroline," he began, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. "As I mentioned in my email, we have a rather delicate situation." Beatrice jumped in, her voice brittle. "What Gideon means to say is that the mill is in trouble. Grave trouble." I kept my face neutral, taking a slow sip of the port. It tasted of raisins and desperation. Blackwood weavers. I thought it was the cornerstone of the family. "It has been," Lord Alistair murmured, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "For 200 years, we've supplied the finest wool and tweed to the most distinguished families in England. We wove the fabrics for royal carriages." "Yes," I said, my patience wearing thin. "But what's its current balance sheet? Who are your major clients today?" The question, so normal in my world, landed on the table like a lead weight. Gideon flinched. Beatrice looked aghast, as if I'd asked about her father's medical history. "It's not that simple, Caroline," Gideon said, recovering slightly. "Our business isn't about balance sheets. It's about reputation, heritage." "Heritage doesn't pay the bills, Gideon," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "What's the problem?" He finally looked at me, his pride warring with his panic. "We've lost the Abercorn contract." He said the name as if it should mean something to me. It didn't. They've gone to a firm in Manchester, one that uses synthetic blends. He said the last two words with the same disgust he might use for chemical warfare. And the bank was not pleased. Our loans were secured against the Abercorn account. So you have a cash flow problem, I stated. It's more than that, Beatrice cut in, her composure finally cracking. The bank is calling in the loan. All of it. They say we're no longer a going concern. They're threatening foreclosure. On the mill? I asked. Gideon's eyes were bleak. On the mill, he confirmed, and on the house. The silence that followed was profound. The great stone manor, the portraits of stern-faced Blackwoods, the centuries of accumulated history. All of it was balanced on a knife's edge, about to be wiped out by something as mundane as a bank loan. I looked at their faces, at the three of them trapped in their beautiful dying world, and I felt a cold, hard knot of something unidentifiable in my chest. It wasn't pity, not yet. It was something closer to vindication. Surely you have other assets, I said, probing. Friends you can turn to. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Beatrice. Friends, she scoffed. Oh, we have friends. Lord Harrington sent his deepest sympathies. The Duke of Westminster said it was a damned shame and invited father to shoot grouse next month. Lady Chamberlain suggested we hold a fundraising gala. She looked at me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of pure, unadulterated rage. They have all the right opinions. They have all the right titles. What they don't have, apparently, is any actual money they're willing to part with. Not for us. So this was it. The old boy network, the web of aristocratic alliances that they held so dear, had failed them. Their world of unspoken agreements and social currency had proven to be worthless when faced with a real crisis. Their heritage was an empty vault. Gideon leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. He finally made direct eye contact, and in his gaze I saw the raw, humiliating truth of their situation. Caroline, he said, his voice low and strained, we need your help. We were hoping perhaps you might be interested in a partnership, an investment, a chance for you to finally connect with your mother's legacy in a meaningful way. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost pathetic. He was trying to frame it as a gift to me, an opportunity for the crass American to buy her way into their hallowed history. He wasn't asking for a rescue. He was offering me a transaction that would allow him to keep some shred of his pride. They wanted my new money to save their old name, and they wanted me to be grateful for the privilege. I let the silence stretch, savoring the exquisite discomfort on their faces. I thought of every condescending smile, every backhanded compliment, every subtle reminder that I was not, and never would be, one of them. And now, here they were. Their ancient, pedigreed world was on fire, and I was the only one holding a bucket of water. I placed my glass down on the polished wood with a soft click. I'm not interested in a partnership, Gideon, I said, my voice dangerously calm. But I am interested in the business. Before I consider anything, I'll need to see everything. The ledgers, the production reports, the employee rosters, the loan agreements. I paused, looking each of them in the eye. And tomorrow morning, you're going to give me a full tour of the mill. The look on their faces was a perfect storm of hope, resentment, and pure, undiluted shock. They had come to me for a handout dressed up as an investment. They didn't expect me to treat it like a business, my business. But that was the only way I knew how to operate. Their world was ending, and mine was just beginning. The next morning, Gideon drove me to the mill in his aging Land Rover, the engine rattling in protest. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and coal smoke. Blackwood weavers sat in a small valley. A collection of grim, soot-stained brick buildings clustered around a tall chimney that puffed lazy gray clouds into the overcast sky. It looked less like a functioning factory and more like a museum exhibit on the Industrial Revolution. Gideon walked me through the main weaving shed, his voice taking on a practiced, reverent tone, the kind a tour guide uses for a cathedral. This, Caroline, is the heart of the operation, he announced, gesturing to a vast, cavernous room filled with rows of enormous, dark metal looms. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of clanking, whirring, and rhythmic thumping that vibrated up through the soles of my shoes. But beneath the cacophony, I could hear the discordant notes of inefficiency. Several machines were silent, shrouded in canvas tarps. Another was being worked on by a mechanic who looked as old as the machine itself. This loom here, Gideon shouted over the din, patting a particularly monstrous iron beast, was installed by our great-grandfather in a marvel of its time. It still produces the finest tweed in the country. I looked at the loom not as a historian, but as an investor. I saw a massive, energy-guzzling relic that required constant, expensive maintenance and could likely only produce one type of fabric at a painfully slow pace. It wasn't a marvel, it was a liability. I ignored his curated tour. I saw a man in a tweed jacket with patched elbows poring over a design sheet and walked over to him. "Excuse me," I said, raising my voice. "I'm Cara Hayes." He looked up, his eyes weary but intelligent. "Mr. Finch," he introduced himself. "Floor manager." "Mr. Finch," I said, shaking his hand. "Gideon was just telling me about this loom. What's its output per hour?" Mr. Finch glanced nervously at Gideon, who was hovering nearby, a frown creasing his forehead. "Well, miss, that depends. If we're running the standard Blackwood tartan and the humidity is right, and she doesn't throw a shuttle, maybe 8 meters an hour." 8 meters. I did a quick calculation in my head. A modern loom could do 10 times that. "And how often does she throw a shuttle?" I asked. A wry smile touched Mr. Finch's lips. "More often than we'd like. She's a temperamental old girl." I spent the next hour talking to Mr. Finch and a few of the weavers, ignoring Gideon's increasingly impatient sighs. I asked about supply chains, waste percentages, order fulfillment times, and employee training. The answers painted a grim picture. They were sourcing their wool from a single, expensive supplier out of tradition. Their design process was archaic, done by hand on graph paper. They had no digital inventory system. Workers were loyal, some of them third-generation weavers, but they were demoralized. They knew the mill was dying. They could feel it in the cold drafts that snaked through the broken window panes and in the dwindling number of orders pinned to the bulletin board. Gideon finally corralled me towards the small, wood-paneled office. "I'm not sure what you hope to achieve by interrogating the staff, Caroline," he said, his voice tight with irritation. "They are craftsmen, not cogs in a machine. They're employees in a business that's about to go under," I retorted, stopping in front of him. "And they know more about why it's failing than you do." The barb hit its mark. He paled slightly but said nothing, leading me into the office where dusty, leather-bound ledgers were stacked on a massive desk. For the next 2 days I shut myself in that office. The smell of old paper and stale pipe smoke clung to everything. I traded my blazer for one of Beatrice's old jumpers and dove into the numbers. It was a disaster, worse than I could have imagined. They hadn't been profitable in over a decade. They had been surviving by selling off small parcels of ancestral land, chipping away at their own estate to meet payroll. They had taken out high-interest loans against their blue-chip clients, and now that the biggest of those had left, the whole house of cards was collapsing. There was no business plan, no strategy for growth, no marketing budget. There was only tradition, pride, and a slow, dignified march towards bankruptcy. On the third evening, I requested a meeting. I found Gideon, Beatrice, and Lord Alistair in the drawing room, attempting to maintain their evening ritual of sherry and quiet contemplation. The fire crackled in the grate, casting long shadows on their anxious faces. I didn't sit down. I stood before them, my tablet in my hand, feeling like a doctor about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. "The situation is critical," I began, my tone devoid of emotion. "The business model is unsustainable. The infrastructure is obsolete. The brand has stagnated. You're not running a company, you're curating a museum." I laid out the framework of a plan, a radical, painful, and necessary overhaul. First, we need a massive capital injection to modernize. New looms, computerized inventory, a new roof for the weaving shed. Second, we diversify the product line. The bespoke tweed for a handful of aristocrats is a niche, not a business. We need to target new markets. High-end boutique hotels, corporate interiors, capsule collections with emerging British designers. Beatrice let out a small gasp of horror. "Designer collaborations? Caroline, how utterly vulgar. We are Blackwood weavers. We have a royal warrant. We don't chase trends." "Beatrice, you don't have enough customers to constitute a trend," I shot back. "Right now, your royal warrant and a few quid will get you a cup of tea. It won't stop the bank from seizing this house." I turned to Gideon. "Third, we have to restructure the entire workflow. That means retraining some staff, and yes, it probably means letting some people go. We streamline the supply chain, find more competitive wool suppliers, even if they haven't been supplying the Blackwoods since the Napoleonic Wars." Gideon shook his head, a look of profound sorrow on his face. You just don't understand, do you? You see a factory, but this is a community. Generations of families have worked for us. We can't simply streamline them away. Your American slash-and-burn tactics have no place here. The essence of our brand is its unchanging nature. Its unchanging nature is driving it into the grave, I said, my voice rising with frustration. You're so obsessed with the story of the brand that you've forgotten to actually sell anything. You need a website. You need a marketing team. You need to exist in the 21st century. A Blackwood does not need to advertise, Lord Alistair said, his voice quiet but firm. It was the first time he'd spoken. Our quality speaks for itself. No, it doesn't, I said, looking at the old man. Because no one can hear it. No one knows you exist outside of a 50-mile radius and a dozen aging lords. Quality is useless without access. The conversation was going nowhere. They looked at me as if I were a vandal, suggesting we spray paint the family portraits. They were recoiling from the very ideas that could save them, clinging to the romantic notions that were sinking them. The mockery was back in their eyes, subtler now, tinged with fear, but still there. I was the crass American, the barbarian at the gates, with no appreciation for history or subtlety. I felt a surge of cold anger, but also a strange sense of clarity. For my entire life, I had sought some kind of acceptance from them, some acknowledgement that my world, my skills, had value. I saw now that I would never get it. They were incapable of seeing value in anything that didn't already exist within their own rarefied bubble. And in that moment, my motivation shifted. The faint, ghostly desire to honor my mother's memory was replaced by something harder, sharper. It was no longer about saving them or earning their respect. It was about proving them wrong. It was about taking this broken, beautiful, useless thing and making it work. Not for them, but for me. I wanted to see the look on their faces when my vulgar ideas and slash-and-burn tactics brought this place back from the dead. I left them in the drawing room, their faces pale in the firelight, and went for a walk in the damp garden. The air was cold and clean. As I stood looking back at the dark silhouette of the manor, a figure emerged from the shadows near the servants' entrance. It was Mr. Finch, the mill manager, holding his flat cap in his hands. "Begging your pardon, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I hope I'm not overstepping." "Not at all, Mr. Finch. What is it?" He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I couldn't help but overhear some of the staff talking about the ideas you were discussing at the mill the other day, about the new looms, the hotel contracts." He looked up, his gaze direct and clear. "I just wanted to say, it's the first bit of sense I've heard spoken about that place in 20 years. Lord Alistair's father, he had the pride. And Lord Alistair himself, he has the history. And young Mr. Gideon, he's got a bit of both." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But none of them, forgive me for saying, has any business sense. They've been polishing the brass on a sinking ship." His words were a balm on my frustration. It was the validation I hadn't even realized I was craving. It wasn't from my family, from the people who shared my blood, but from a stranger, a man who loved the mill enough to see the hard truth of it. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," I said, a real smile touching my lips for the first time in days. "I appreciate that. If you decide to move forward," he said, "you'll have good people who will follow you. People who want to work, who want to see the mill survive. Just tell us what needs doing." He nodded, put his cap back on, and disappeared into the misty night. I stood there for a long time, the chills seeping into my bones, but I no longer felt cold. A decision had crystallized within me. I wasn't just going to offer them a lifeline. I was going to take control. The call came 4 days later. It was the bank's solicitor, a man with a brisk, unsentimental voice. He informed Gideon that their final appeal for an extension had been denied. They had 1 week, 7 days, to present a fully funded, professionally vetted restructuring plan. If they failed, the foreclosure notices would be posted on the gates of the mill and the front door of the manor. The end was no longer a vague threat. It had a date and a time. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. The forced politeness evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating dread. Beatrice drifted through the halls like a ghost, her face pale and drawn. Gideon locked himself in the study for hours, making frantic, useless phone calls that always ended in him slamming the receiver down. Lord Alistair simply sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if watching his entire world turn to ash. They were paralyzed, trapped in the final stage of grief for a life they had always taken for granted. They were waiting for a miracle, for some divine intervention that was the birthright of the aristocracy. But no miracle was coming. There was only me. On the 6th day, with the deadline looming less than 24 hours away, I told Gideon I was ready to make my final offer. I requested a formal meeting in the dining hall. Not the cozy drawing room, but the grand, imposing space where they had judged me over countless meals. I wanted them on my turf, or at least on turf I was about to claim. They assembled around the long, dark table, looking like prisoners awaiting their sentence. Beatrice, Gideon, and a visibly shaken Lord Alistair. They had brought their family solicitor, a frail, elderly man named Mr. Pembroke, who clutched a worn leather briefcase as if it were a shield. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and fear. I stood at the head of the table, the spot usually reserved for my uncle. I didn't have a briefcase full of papers. I had my tablet and a single printed document. I let them squirm in the silence for a full minute before I began. I have spent the last week analyzing the state of Blackwood weavers and the larger estate, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. My initial assessment was correct. The business is insolvent, the assets are over-leveraged, and the management has been negligent. Gideon bristled, opening his mouth to object, but I held up a hand and he fell silent. However, I continued, I do not believe the situation is unsalvageable. The brand, despite your best efforts to run it into the ground, still has a flicker of value. The workforce is skilled and loyal. The historical significance has potential, if marketed correctly. I paused, letting my words sink in. I am prepared to make an investment. I will provide the full capital injection required to satisfy the bank, modernize the mill, and cover operational costs for the next 2 years. A collective sigh of relief went through them. Gideon visibly relaxed. Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment. They thought they had won. They thought the crass American was going to write a check and save them. But this will not be a partnership, I said, my voice turning to ice. This will be a takeover. I slid the single document across the polished table towards Gideon. My capital will save this family, this house, and this mill. In exchange, I will be taking a 90% controlling interest in a new, restructured company, Blackwood and Hayes. The Blackwood family will retain a 10% non-voting share and 1 ceremonial seat on the board. I will be the chief executive officer with full and unilateral operational control. You will have no say in the day-to-day running of the business. You will have no veto power. You will be silent partners, or more accurately, silent beneficiaries of my work. The silence that followed was deafening. Then chaos erupted. This is outrageous, Beatrice shrieked, jumping to her feet. You're a vulture, a colonialist, coming to pick the bones of your own family. You would strip us of our birthright. Gideon was white with fury, his hands clenched into fists on the table. This is our name, our legacy, 200 years of history. You want to slap your name on it and turn it into some soulless American corporation. You have no right. Lord Alistair looked at me, his eyes filled with a look of such profound betrayal it almost made me flinch. Amelia's child, he whispered, his voice cracking. How could you? This was it, the moment of truth. All the years of being belittled, of being treated as a lesser, of having my ambition and my very nature mocked, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice. I met their anger with a calm that was more terrifying than any rage. My right? I said, my voice low and cutting, my eyes locked on Gideon. Let's talk about rights, and let's talk about legacy. I started to pace slowly behind my chair. For 20 years you've mocked me. You mocked my accent. You mocked my clothes. You mocked my education. You mocked my directness. Well, this is direct. Your business is failing because you've been running it on nostalgia and arrogance instead of on sound financial principles. I turned my gaze to Beatrice. You called my ideas vulgar. You turned up your nose at marketing and modernizing. Well, your dignity and tradition have brought you to the brink of ruin. My vulgar ideas about profit and efficiency are the only thing that can generate the revenue to keep this roof over your head. You're worried about your birthright. You were about to lose it for nothing. I'm offering you a chance to keep a piece of it. Finally, I looked at my uncle, Lord Alistair. You speak of my mother, your daughter, the one you treated like an outcast because she chose to build a new life instead of languishing in this one. And you sneered at my father, the man she loved. You sneered at his new money. Let me tell you something about that new money. He earned it. He earned it through sleepless nights, through innovation, through taking risks, through the kind of hard, relentless work that you and your ancestors have never had to contemplate. And that money, which you have so consistently disdained, is now the only thing on this earth that can save your precious old money legacy. I stopped pacing and placed my hands on the back of the chair, leaning forward slightly. You talk about legacy, Gideon. A legacy isn't a museum piece that you allow to crumble with dignity. A legacy is something you fight for, you adapt, you build upon, you keep alive for the next generation. You haven't been preserving a legacy here. You have been presiding over a very long, very expensive funeral. I straightened up, my speech finished. The fire had gone out of them, replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. They had never been spoken to this way in their lives. They had no defense because every word I said was the truth. You had a choice, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. Years of choices. You could have treated me like family. You could have welcomed my ideas. When this crisis began, you could have come to me with honesty and respect. But you didn't. You came to me with a condescending, manipulative proposal, hoping to use me. You treated me like a crude, open wallet you could flatter into saving you. So we are no longer talking as cousins, we are talking as business people, and this is the deal on the table. I picked up my tablet and walked towards the door. My lawyer has the paperwork ready to be signed. My offer is valid until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. After that, I will be on a plane back to California, and you can explain your heritage to the auctioneers. I paused at the doorway and looked back at them. You can have 10% of a thriving future, or you can have 100% of a glorious past. The choice is yours. I walked out of the dining hall and didn't look back, leaving them to drown in the wreckage of their own pride. That night, sleep was impossible. The adrenaline from the confrontation coursed through me, a strange mix of exhilaration and exhaustion. I pulled on a coat and walked out into the gardens, the damp, cold air a shock to my system. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the only light came from the few windows still illuminated in the great dark house. I walked the overgrown paths, my feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. I thought of my mother, wondering what she would think of the bomb I had just dropped on her family. Would she see it as a betrayal? Or would she, the woman who had been brave enough to walk away from all this, understand? I felt a profound sense of release, as if a weight I had been carrying my entire life had finally been lifted. I had spoken the truth. I had met their condescension not with anger but with competence. Yet there was a strange sadness intertwined with the victory. I had come seeking connection and found only a failing business. I was sitting on a cold stone bench overlooking the misty valley when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. It was Gideon. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, painting the clouds in shades of gray and pale pink. He looked terrible. His clothes were rumpled, his face was pale, and he looked as if he had aged a decade overnight. The arrogant, self-assured cousin of my memory was gone, replaced by a defeated man. He stopped a few feet away, not looking at me, but out at the view. "We spoke with Pembroke," he said, his voice hoarse. He reviewed the terms. He advised us to accept. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes hollow. "We accept your offer, Caroline." The words sounded like they were being dragged from him, each one leaving a wound. "It's Cara," I said softly. He just nodded, a slight, jerky movement. "Cara," he repeated, as if trying out the name of a stranger. Later that morning, the solicitor's office was a place of quiet, formal surrender. The papers were signed, the documents notarized. I initiated the wire transfer from my phone, a sum of money so large it felt unreal, sending it across the ocean to a small local bank in the English countryside. With a few taps on a screen, I had purchased my mother's history. The atmosphere in Blackwood Manor for the next few days was funereal. Beatrice would turn and walk the other way if she saw me in a hallway. Lord Alistair took his meals in his room. The house was filled with the ghosts of their pride. My first official day as CEO of Blackwood and Hayes was crisp and cold. I drove myself to the mill, not in Gideon's rattling Land Rover, but in my own rental car. I walked into the weaving shed, and the cacophony of the looms slowly ground to a halt as workers noticed my presence. They gathered in the center of the floor, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and suspicion. Gideon stood at the back of the crowd, a silent, awkward observer as per the terms of our agreement. I stood on a small wooden crate so they could all see me. "Good morning," I said, my voice clear and strong, carrying over the silent machinery. "My name is Cara Hayes. As of yesterday, I am the new chief executive officer of this company. A murmur went through the crowd. I know there are a lot of rumors flying around, so let me be direct. Blackwood Weavers was on the verge of being shut down forever. That is no longer going to happen. Your jobs are secure. A wave of palpable relief washed over them. But things are going to change, I continued, my tone serious. Hard changes are coming. We are going to modernize. We are going to become efficient. We are going to become profitable. My goal is not to destroy the history of this place, but to make sure it has a future, a long and prosperous one. I looked out at the faces, meeting as many eyes as I could. I'm not asking for your trust. I know I have to earn it, but I am asking for your hard work and your ideas. I then pointed to the man standing beside me. This is Mr. Finch. I'm promoting him to general manager. He will be running the day-to-day operations. He has my full confidence, and he should have yours. The workers looked at Mr. Finch, one of their own, now standing in a position of authority, and I saw a glimmer of hope dawn in their eyes. This wasn't just another faceless owner, this was something different. The meeting ended, and the sound of the looms slowly started up again, a hesitant, then strengthening heartbeat. The first board meeting was excruciating. It was held in the mill's dusty office, with me, Mr. Finch, and Gideon. He sat stiffly in his chair, a ceremonial member of a board he used to command. He tried to interject, to offer his opinions on a new logo design. It lacks the traditional crest, he'd said. It feels too I didn't argue. I simply pointed to a sales projection chart. The traditional crest, I said calmly, is associated with a brand that has been losing money for 12 years. This clean logo is for a company that intends to be profitable by the fourth quarter. Any other thoughts, Gideon? He fell silent, his face flushing. He was a ghost at his own feast, powerless, his opinions irrelevant. It was a cruel education, but a necessary one. He had to understand that his world, with its rules based on birth and tradition, was over. The new world was based on results, and I was the one delivering them. A year can change everything. I split my time between my life in San Francisco and my new, unexpected life in England. The mill, now officially Blackwood & Hayes, was unrecognizable. Gleaming new Italian looms hummed efficiently next to a few of the original, lovingly restored heritage machines, which were now used for special, high-margin bespoke orders. We had a modern website, a small but fiercely effective digital marketing team, and a growing list of clients. Our first major contract was to supply all the fabrics for a new chain of ultra-luxury boutique hotels across Europe. And our first designer collaboration, a line of bold architectural coats with a brilliant young London designer, had been a surprise hit, featured in Vogue and sold out within a month. For the first time in 15 years, the company was not just solvent, it was turning a healthy profit. The changes in the mill were mirrored, more slowly and subtly, at the manor. The roof was repaired, the gardens were tended, the scent of decay was gone, replaced by the faint smell of fresh paint and new beginnings. My relationship with my cousins had shifted from open hostility to a state of cautious, bewildered truce. They didn't understand my methods, but they could not argue with the results. The dividends from their 10% share were more money than they had seen in years. Beatrice, surprisingly, was the first to thaw. One afternoon, she found me in the study, poring over market analysis reports. She hovered in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Cara," she said, her voice unusually hesitant. "I was looking at some of these tech stocks you mentioned once. I was wondering if you thought they were a sound investment." It was a small thing, but it was monumental. She was asking for my opinion. She was acknowledging my expertise. She was, for the first time, seeing me not as her crass American cousin, but as someone who knew things she didn't. Gideon's transformation was quieter, but more profound. The humiliation of his demotion had, after a few painful months, burned away his arrogance, leaving something humbler and more curious in its place. He started spending time at the mill, not as a lord of the manor, but as a student. He shadowed Mr. Finch, learning the machines, studying the supply chain, talking to the weavers. He was discovering the business that had his name on it from the ground up, finding a new purpose, not in owning it, but in understanding it. He was finally learning the difference between inheritance and responsibility. The true turning point came during a Christmas visit. The house was warm and bright, filled with the scent of pine and roasting turkey. After dinner, my Uncle Alistair, now so frail he rarely left his favorite armchair by the fire, called me over. He pressed a small, silver-framed photograph into my hand. It was a picture of a young girl with bright, defiant eyes and a mischievous smile, standing on the very lawn I had walked on that night of my decision. It was my mother. She was like you know, he said, his voice a soft, papery whisper. Amelia, always headstrong, full of ideas, saw the world differently than I did. He looked from the photograph to me, his old eyes cloudy with memory and regret. I was a fool not to see it, a stubborn old fool. It wasn't a full apology, it wasn't an absolution for years of coldness and neglect, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement, a crack in the dam of his pride that had stood for a lifetime. In that quiet moment, I realized my victory was more complete than I had ever intended. I hadn't just saved a business, I had inadvertently forced this family to confront the ghosts they had kept locked away for decades, to reassess the very foundations of their identity. As I look back on it all now, I see the profound irony of my journey. I came to England chasing a connection to a family I thought I'd lost. I never found it, not in the way a young girl would hope. I didn't get a warm embrace into their world. Instead, I had to drag their world, kicking and screaming, into mine. My ultimate vindication wasn't in their reluctant apologies or their newfound respect. It was in the steady, rhythmic hum of the new looms. It was in the secure paychecks the weavers took home to their families. It was in the fact that the name Blackwood once again stood for something vital and forward-looking, not just a dusty, glorious past. I had learned that my own worth was not something they could grant or withhold. It was something I had built myself, with the very tools they had once so casually mocked. I learned that sometimes the things people criticize in you are in fact your greatest strengths. Your value isn't determined by their approval or their limited perspective. It exists independently, waiting for you to claim it. Have you ever had an experience like that? A time when you were underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong in the most unexpected way? I would genuinely love to read your stories, so please share them in the comments below. It's in sharing these moments that we realize we're not alone. And of course, if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most unlikely of places. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. And always remember, true legacy isn't about what you inherit, it's about what you choose to build.